Hi, I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you very much, Penguin Random House, for having me. I'm often in the position over the last 2 months since my book was published about speaking about public school teaching to public school teachers, which is a very tough job. So I'm always aware that the people I'm speaking to are in fact the experts. So why did I decide as a journalist to write a 175-year history of the teaching profession called The Teacher Wars? I started on the education beat when I graduated from Brown University. It was about 2006. I went down to Washington, D.C. I was working for a small magazine called The American Prospect. And what I was noticing, and this especially became more acute after the recession hit in late 2008, and if you recall, there was a presidential election going on at that time, we were discussing inequality in this country and child poverty and socioeconomic gaps, more and more in terms of the responsibility of schools and teachers to bridge these gaps and to bring poor children up to middle-class kids' levels academically, and that this was going to have huge macroeconomic consequences. That was the discussion that was taking place. And as President Obama came into office, teaching, again and again, was the only profession that he would mention in his State of the Union addresses year after year. He would say we had to stop making excuses for bad teachers, and he would talk about teacher evaluation down to a pretty granular level. I'm sure a lot of you noticed. This was more and more a discussion in our national politics. And as an education reporter, I wanted to know, why is it that teaching is so controversial? And I started to think of it really as the most controversial profession in America. And I looked at other countries, and I noticed that although education is, a political topic in many other nations around the world, Finland, Japan, Korea, teaching itself is not as embattled, and there's not this rhetoric of failure. And so I wanted to know why that was, and I guessed that the answer lay in our history. So in this short amount of time that I have with you today, I want to go through 10 things I learned about public school teaching from studying the profession's history. And hopefully it will, as it did for me, hopefully it will trigger some thoughts in you in terms of where we are today. So the first thing I learned, which I trace in chapter 1 of the book, is that public school teaching was once a male profession. In 1800, 90% of public school teachers were actually men. And this is something that surprises people again and again. Over the course of the 19th century, it became a job that was dominated by women. Why was that? Well, in the 1800s, we didn't really have a public school system in the United States. It was only around 1830, 1840, 1850, leading up to the Civil War, that policymakers began to say we're going to raise taxes and collect them at the state level and distribute them to local communities for schools. And conservatives at the time, railroad industrialists and other folks, they liked the idea of public schools, but they didn't like the idea of raising taxes too much, unsurprisingly. And bringing women into the profession and redefining the role of the teacher as a female role was a way to save about 50% of the money. So when you think about the issue of teacher pay, historically it cannot be separated from the fact that the job was redefined from about 1800 to 1865 as a job that women were going to do. Of course, one of the reasons why teaching is so controversial is because it's a unionized profession, and only about 7% of private sector workers are in unions. So in this way, teachers are different than many other workers in the American economy. The second thing I want to emphasize from the history is that teacher unionization was a direct outgrowth of the fact that teaching had become a job for women. Because what you see by 1900 is that in cities like New York and Chicago, about 95% of the primary grades teachers are women. And this is used as an excuse again and again to pay them less. And women are fired when they get pregnant, they're fired when they get married. And oftentimes we think of this moment when women teachers were punished for these life cycle events as something that was moral in nature. Like we didn't want kids to ask how the baby got in there and stuff like that. It was actually, a big part of it was actually getting rid of teachers as they got older, 7, 8, 9 years. I mean, not old, but maybe 28, 29, 30, finding ways to get them out of the classroom so that you could replenish the teaching force with cheaper, younger teachers. And in Chicago in 1897, when teachers' unions began, this is one of the things teachers are quite angry about, rightfully so, probably. And this is one of the big pushes toward teaching becoming a unionized profession. Another thing that was going on at that time, and this is the third point I want to make, lessons from history, how many of you are familiar with value-added measurement of teachers? Probably all of you, right? So this is the technique that has become so popular over the past 15 years of using student test scores to evaluate teachers' work, and then creating rewards and punishments for teachers that are tied to these measurements. So it's portrayed as very innovative today, but it is actually not new. Back at the turn of the 20th century, there was something called the pupil change method. And guess what? It was basically exactly like today's value added. It was something that was driven by corporate philanthropists at the time. And as far back as 1912, people were eager to use student test scores in a very similar way to pay teachers. So that was a huge revelation to me when I studied this. The fourth point, how many of you have heard the term no excuses in the education debate? Okay. This is often used to refer to a combination of high academic rigor and high expectations for students, combined with strict discipline, sometimes uniforms, eye tracking, so the student is expected to sort of follow the teacher around the classroom. A lot of the high-profile charter school networks use no excuses strategies. And sometimes they've been portrayed in our current debate as something that white education reformers are imposing on communities of color. One of the things I found in the history was that a lot of these strategies, sometimes talked about in a very different way, but a lot of these strict discipline, high rigor strategies were actually favorite strategies of Black educational leaders dating back all the way to the 1870s. So when we saw Black educators, stream south after the Civil War with this missionary zeal for educating the children and the grandchildren of slaves, strict discipline was often talked about back then by people like Anna Julia Cooper, a wonderful Black feminist teacher who I profile in the book, or W.E.B. Du Bois, as a way to prepare children for an unforgiving and racist world that they were going to be going into. So this was something that's fascinating to me. Of course, I think when someone from your own community tells you no excuses, it's a little bit different than when someone from outside your community tells you no excuses. So just something to think about as we see this swirling around us in the education reform debate. So attacks on teachers' unions, very prominent in our political debate. One of the surprises for me was that although Barack Obama is often talked about as this Democratic trailblazer and that he's the first Democratic president to really be critical of teachers' unions, that's actually not true. Progressives have long had a love-hate relationship with teachers' unions. If you go back to Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, Jane Addams, the famous settlement house crusader, was an early critic of the unions, as she allied with them when their interests aligned, but she was one person who felt that the unions did too much to protect bad teachers. And then in the 1960s, President Johnson, LBJ, he established a program called the National Teacher Corps. It was sort of a proto-Teach for America, over the objections of the National Education Association, the NEA, the big union. So this sort of debate about unions and teachers and the Democratic Party, it's a very old one. And that brings me to my sixth revelation, which is there have always been Teach for Americas. There's so much debate today about Teach for America. It's not the first concept in American life to take 21-year-olds and make them teachers with a couple weeks of training. In the 19th century, there was this thing called the Board of National Popular Education. I write about it in the book. It was started by Catherine Beecher. She was the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And her idea was to take these East Coast young Protestant girls, 19 years old about, give them 5 weeks of summer training, exactly the same number of weeks as Teach for America, and then send them to frontier one-room schoolhouses out in the West. So remarkably similar to Teach for America today. And then I mentioned LBJ and the Teacher Corps. This was something that was modeled on the Peace Corps, started in the 1960s, lasted till about 1980, and it was, again, a similar concept. Desegregation and integration of schools. I think most of us have the conception today that the push to desegregate our schools to make sure that children of different races and classes are sitting in the same classrooms alongside one another is a failed movement. It's something I look at really closely in the book around the social science. And desegregation is certainly not a silver bullet. In a lot of places it was implemented poorly. Black children were the only ones that were expected to get on the bus in a lot of places. But in some places, like in North Carolina and Maryland, certain school districts had a track record of success. And what they found was that desegregation programs were associated with high-quality teachers being more likely to teach low-income students, and also with a faster closing of the achievement gap than at almost any other time in American history. So in these places in Maryland and North Carolina that successfully desegregated their schools, they saw big leaps in achievement gains in reading and math for kids that have not been equaled by the current reform efforts that we've tried in the past 10 years. Race to the top. How many of you have felt that race to the top has impacted your work or the way your schools? Yeah. So Race to the Top, of course, was President Obama's signature school reform effort, and it asked states, if you would like federal money from Washington, please evaluate all your teachers according to whether they grow student learning. And what I noticed in my travels around the country as an education journalist is that most states, unsurprisingly, were choosing what they perceived as the cheapest and easiest way to do this, which was to create new tests and use tests as the main measure of student growth. And so I saw, and I tell this story in the book, I saw districts that were doing standardized testing, bubble tests, in art, in music, and even in physical education class. Something that I write about that happened in Florida is this idea of shared attribution. So let's say you teach 7th grade health, and there is no standardized test for 7th grade health. You're going to be held accountable for the math and reading scores in your grade. Well, maybe in your state, the math and reading test is in 9th grade. So you're going to be held accountable for the 9th grade scores on the rationale, supposedly, that 2 years ago you helped those kids do better in some way. And actually, this led to certain absurdities. For example, in Florida, teachers getting evaluated based on the test scores of students they had never met. Because think about it, if you're a first-year teacher, you've actually never met the 9th grader who was at your school 2 years ago. So I've had the opportunity actually to interview both Secretary Arne Duncan and the president about this. And I can tell you for certain they didn't anticipate that this is how states would implement their policy. But it was one of the unfortunate unintended consequences. And so I think teachers do have a right to be asking questions about this. And we know from polling of teachers that teachers are not so hot on a lot of these policies. That's an understatement. Let's see. I wanted, the second to last point I want to make, I'm going through 10 points. I know you've lost track. I'm at number 9. Teaching to the test. We have good research showing that since No Child Left Behind and this big push that we've had around standardized testing for kids, followed by Race to the Top, which doubled down on it, we know that there's more teaching to the test going on now than there was 20 years ago, and that this is focused, unfortunately, in low-income schools, where the pressure to raise the test scores is highest. I wanted to tell you about the work of a fascinating cognitive scientist called Andrew Butler, because what he actually found, and I think this is hopeful, and I like to end on a positive note, is that teaching to the test does not work. What he found is that standardized test scores themselves are lower if the teacher spent a lot of time drilling and killing on multiple choice. So paradoxically, although a lot of schools have reorganized themselves to spend more time doing drill and kill as a response to these policies, what the science is now showing us, newer research, is that if we didn't do that, we would get better results. So that's something hopeful that you can maybe take back to your principal. So more rigor leads to better results, unsurprisingly, to most teachers. And then the very last point, and this is where I end this, pretty sweeping 200-year history, is that one thing we know about American teaching and how it differs from teaching in other parts of the world is that our educators spend about 85% of their time in front of kids and very little time collaborating with other adults. We have built a system that does not build in time for adult collaboration. And adult collaboration, teaching skills to one another, making sure novice teachers in that crucial first year, which is so hellish for so many teachers, have mentorship. Not just any mentor, but a mentor who's been shown to have some real skills in teaching adults. That's very important. Lesson planning together, in groups, in pairs. This sort of collaboration has turned around other nations' schools. It's not something that we have the systems to implement right now in this country. So those are the sort of hopeful reforms that I think we can take from this history. What have we never done? We have never accepted that the more rigorous curriculum that's not test-focused leads to better results. And we have never allowed teachers to collaborate, spend their time collaborating with other adults to lead to better results for kids. Thank you very much.